I inherited my grandfather's old bookstore, and I thought it was haunted. Books would move overnight, I'd smell fresh coffee in the morning, and I'd hear footsteps upstairs when no one was supposed to be there. I was convinced the place was filled with ghosts. I had no idea the truth was far more incredible than any ghost story. Before we dive into this mystery, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more incredible stories every day. Now, let's head back to that creaky old bookstore. The letter from the lawyer arrived on a Tuesday morning, sandwiched between a stack of overdue bills and a final notice from my student loan company. I almost threw it away, assuming it was another debt collector using official letterhead to scare me. But something about the return address made me pause. Estate of Harold Whitman. My grandfather, a man I had seen maybe 5 times in my entire 28 years of life. I sat in my cramped studio apartment, surrounded by the evidence of my own financial disaster, and read the impossible words. Harold Whitman, my mother's estranged father, had left me his bookstore, a place called Pages and Time in a small town called Milbrook, 3 hours upstate. I had vague childhood memories of visiting it once or twice, a dusty, maze-like place that smelled of old paper and pipe tobacco, presided over by a quiet, bearded man who seemed more comfortable with books than people. The timing was either perfect or catastrophic, depending on how you looked at it. I was a substitute teacher, drowning in student debt, living paycheck to paycheck in a city that seemed designed to crush people like me. The inheritance was either my salvation or my final burden. According to the lawyer's letter, the property came with significant back taxes, a failing business, and a building that needed extensive repairs. But it also came with something I desperately needed, an escape route. I also learned in the letter that I had already received an offer from a development company. They wanted to buy the entire block, tear down the old buildings, and put up luxury condos. The offer was enough to pay off my debts and give me a fresh start somewhere else. All I had to do was drive up there, sign the papers, and walk away from a piece of family history I had never really been part of anyway. The drive to Milbrook was a journey back in time. The closer I got to the town, the more the landscape seemed to slow down, to breathe. The highway gave way to winding country roads lined with maple trees that were just beginning to turn gold in the early October air. The town itself was like something from a postcard, a main street lined with brick buildings from another era, most of them empty now, their windows dark and their for lease signs faded by years of sun and rain. Pages and Time sat in the middle of the block like a stubborn old man refusing to leave his favorite chair. It was a narrow 3-story brick building squeezed between a closed hardware store and an abandoned diner. The painted sign above the door was peeling, and the large front windows were so dusty they were almost opaque. But there was something about it, something that made me turn off the car and just sit there for a moment, looking at this place that was now somehow mine. The key the lawyer had given me turned easily in the old lock, and the door opened with a long, protesting creak that seemed to echo through the entire building. The smell hit me immediately, that same mixture of old paper, dust, and something else I couldn't quite identify, something warm and comforting, like cinnamon and coffee. The interior was exactly as I remembered it from childhood, only more so. Books everywhere, stacked on shelves that reached from floor to ceiling, piled on tables, arranged in precarious towers on the floor. It was a bibliophile's dream and a fire marshal's nightmare. Narrow aisles wound between the stacks like paths through a paper forest, and everything was covered in a fine layer of dust that danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the dirty windows. I spent the first hour just wandering, trying to get a sense of what I had inherited. The ground floor was the main shop, with sections for fiction, history, poetry, and what appeared to be an extensive collection of local authors I had never heard of. There was an old cash register that looked like it belonged in a museum, and behind the counter, a small office area with a desk buried under papers and ledgers. The second floor was more of the same. More books, more dust, more evidence of a business that had been slowly dying for years. But it was when I climbed the narrow, creaking stairs to the third floor that things started to feel strange. The third floor was supposed to be storage, according to the building plans the lawyer had shown me. But as I reached the top of the stairs, I noticed something odd. The air was different up here, cleaner. And there was that smell again, stronger now. Coffee, definitely coffee, and something else. Something that smelled like life. I walked slowly down the narrow hallway, my footsteps echoing on the old wooden floors. There were boxes stacked along the walls and more bookshelves, but everything seemed too neat, too organized. Not like storage at all, but like someone had been taking care of things up here. That's when I heard it. A sound so soft I almost missed it. A gentle thud, like a book being set down on a table. I froze, my heart suddenly hammering in my chest. The building was supposed to be empty. I was supposed to be alone. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and uncertain in the dusty silence. "Is someone there?" Nothing. Just the settling sounds of an old building and the distant hum of traffic from the street below. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Old buildings made noise. Pipes settled, wood expanded and contracted. There was a perfectly logical explanation for everything. But as I turned to head back downstairs, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On a small table near the window, a table that had been empty when I walked past it just moments before, sat a steaming cup of coffee. I ran. I'm not proud of it, but I ran down those stairs like the devil himself was chasing me, through the maze of books, and out onto the street where I stood gasping in the cool October air, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my car keys. I drove straight to the only motel in town, a sad little place called the Milbrook Inn, and checked into a room that smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. I sat on the thin mattress, staring at the water stain on the ceiling, and tried to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing. Stress, that's all it was. The stress of inheriting a property I couldn't afford to keep and couldn't afford to lose. But I couldn't shake the image of that coffee cup, the steam rising from it like a ghost made visible. The next morning, I returned to the bookstore with a thermos of coffee from the diner down the street and a determination to approach this whole situation like the rational, educated woman I was supposed to be. Ghosts didn't exist. There was a logical explanation for everything that had happened, and I was going to find it. The first thing I noticed when I unlocked the door was the smell. That coffee smell was stronger than ever, and underneath it, something else. Something that smelled like breakfast, like bacon and eggs and toast. My stomach growled, reminding me that I had been too nervous to eat much the night before. I made my way through the ground floor, checking every corner, every shadow. Everything looked exactly as I had left it. But when I climbed the stairs to the second floor, I found something that made me stop dead in my tracks. The books had been moved. Not dramatically, not obviously, but moved nonetheless. A section of poetry that had been scattered and disorganized the day before was now neatly arranged, alphabetized by author. A pile of local history books that had been gathering dust on a table was now prominently displayed on a shelf near the window, as if someone wanted them to be seen. My hands were shaking as I climbed the stairs to the third floor. The hallway looked the same, but as I approached the area where I had seen the coffee cup, I noticed something new. A small stack of books on the table, books that definitely hadn't been there before. And next to them, a folded piece of paper. With trembling fingers, I picked up the note. The handwriting was elegant, old-fashioned, the kind of penmanship they didn't teach anymore. It was written in fountain pen ink, deep blue against cream-colored paper. "Dear Miss Whitman, I apologize for startling you yesterday. That was not my intention. Your grandfather was a good man, and I know he would be proud to see you here. Please don't be afraid. I mean you no harm. I have been caring for this place for many years, and I would be honored to continue doing so if you'll allow it. The books miss having visitors. Perhaps we could arrange a proper introduction. A.M. I read the note 3 times, my mind struggling to process what it meant. Someone was living here. Someone had been living here, apparently for years, taking care of my grandfather's bookstore like some kind of literary guardian angel. But who and why? I spent the rest of the day searching the building from top to bottom, looking for any sign of where this mysterious caretaker might be hiding. I found nothing. No secret rooms, no hidden passages, no evidence of anyone living in the building. But the signs of their presence were everywhere once I knew what to look for. A bookmark moved from one page to another. A chair positioned just so, as if someone had been sitting in it recently. The faint impression of a head on a cushion that should have been undisturbed for months. That evening, I sat in my motel room with my laptop, researching everything I could find about the building, about my grandfather, about the history of Milbrook itself. What I found was a story of a town slowly dying, of businesses closing one by one as young people moved away and old people passed on. But I also found something else, references to pages in time that didn't make sense. There were mentions in the local newspaper of poetry readings at the bookstore, of book clubs and literary discussions, events that had supposedly taken place over the past several years, long after my grandfather's health had begun to fail, long after he should have been able to organize such gatherings by himself. I knew I had to go back. I had to find this A.M., this ghost who left notes and moved books and somehow kept a dying bookstore alive. But this time, I wasn't going to run. The next morning, I returned to Pages and Time with a plan. I brought supplies, sandwiches, bottled water, a thermos of coffee, and a folding chair. I was going to wait. However long it took, I was going to wait until this mysterious caretaker revealed themselves. I set up my vigil in the main shop, positioning myself where I could see both the front door and the staircase leading to the upper floors. I brought a book to read, one of my grandfather's favorites, according to the inscription I found inside the cover, and settled in for what I assumed would be a long wait. I didn't have to wait long. It was just after noon when I heard it. The soft sound of footsteps on the floor above, slow and careful, as if someone was trying not to be heard. My heart began to race, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had come here for answers, and I was going to get them. The footsteps moved across the second floor, paused, and then began to descend the stairs. I gripped my book tighter, my eyes fixed on the staircase, waiting for my first glimpse of the person who had been sharing this space with me. He appeared slowly, one step at a time, as if he was as nervous about this encounter as I was. He was an elderly man, probably in his 70s, with silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard. He was wearing a cardigan sweater over a white shirt, and he moved with the careful dignity of someone who had learned to make himself small, to take up as little space as possible in the world. When he saw me sitting there, he stopped, his hand resting on the banister. For a long moment, we just looked at each other, two strangers who had been sharing the same space without knowing it. "Miss Whitman," he said, finally, his voice soft and cultured, with just a hint and an accent I couldn't place. "I'm Anthony Morrison. I believe you found my note." "Mr. Morrison," I said, standing up slowly, not wanting to startle him, "I think we need to talk." He nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth.
"Yes," he said. "I believe we do. Would you care for some tea? I was just about to put the kettle on." And that's how I found myself following a man I had never met up the stairs of my own inherited bookstore to discover a secret that had been hidden in plain sight for 20 years.
The door was behind a bookshelf on the second floor, so cleverly concealed that I had walked past it dozens of times without noticing. Anthony moved the shelf aside with practiced ease, revealing a narrow doorway that led to what had once been the building's original apartment. It was like stepping into another world. The space was small, but immaculately kept, with a tiny kitchen, a sitting area lined with bookshelves, and what I assumed was a bedroom beyond. Everything was neat, organized, and filled with the kind of personal touches that spoke of a life lived quietly, but with great care. There were plants on the windowsills, paintings on the walls, and everywhere, books. More books than I had ever seen in a private residence. "Please, sit," Anthony said, gesturing to a comfortable-looking armchair near the window. "I'll make us some tea, and then I'll tell you everything." As he busied himself in the small kitchen, I looked around the apartment, trying to piece together the story of this man who had been living above my grandfather's bookstore like some kind of literary hermit. The books on his shelves were an eclectic mix: poetry, philosophy, history, literature in several languages. There were photographs on a small table, black and white images of people I didn't recognize, and a framed diploma from Columbia University. "You're wondering how I came to be here," Anthony said, returning with a tea service that looked like it belonged in a much grander setting. "It's not a particularly exciting story, I'm afraid, but it is, I hope, an understandable one." He poured the tea with the careful precision of someone who had turned the simple act into a ritual, and then settled into the chair across from me. "I was a professor once," he began, his voice taking on the cadence of someone who was used to telling stories. "Literature at a small college upstate. I had a wife, Margaret, and a daughter, Sarah. We lived in a little house near the campus, and I thought I had everything a man could want: a job I loved, a family I adored, a future that seemed bright and certain." He paused, staring into his teacup, as if he could see the past reflected in its depths. 22 years ago, they were killed in a car accident. A drunk driver ran a red light on a rainy night, and in an instant, everything I thought I knew about the world, about myself, about the meaning of life, was gone. I felt my throat tighten with sympathy. "I am so sorry," I whispered. He nodded, acknowledging my condolence with a small, sad smile. "I fell apart, as you might imagine. I couldn't teach, couldn't write, couldn't do anything but sit in that empty house and wait for the pain to stop. Eventually, the college let me go. I lost the house, lost everything, really. I spent a few years drifting, moving from town to town, taking odd jobs when I could find them, sleeping in shelters when I couldn't. I arrived in Milbrook on a cold night in November, 20 years ago. I had been walking for hours, and I was exhausted, hungry, and desperate for somewhere warm to spend the night. I saw the bookstore, saw that it was closed, but that there were lights on upstairs. I thought perhaps I could sleep in the doorway just for a few hours until morning. "But my grandfather found you?" I said, beginning to understand.
"Harold found me," Anthony confirmed. "He came down to open the store early the next morning, and there I was, huddled in his doorway like a piece of human debris. I expected him to call the police, to have me moved along. Instead, he invited me in for coffee." Anthony's eyes grew distant, remembering. We talked for hours that morning, about books, about life, about loss. Harold had lost his wife just a few years before, and he understood something about grief that most people don't. He didn't try to fix me or save me. He just listened. And he offered you a place to stay, I said. Not immediately, Anthony said. First, he offered me a job. He said the bookstore needed someone who understood books, someone who could help customers find what they were really looking for, not just what they thought they wanted. He said I could work for room and board, at least until I got back on my feet. But I never did get back on my feet, not in the way he meant, Anthony continued, his voice soft with memory. I found something here that I hadn't expected to find again. Purpose. Community. A reason to wake up in the morning that didn't involve simply enduring another day. He gestured around the small apartment. Harold showed me this space. It had been his father's apartment, back when the family lived above the store. It was full of boxes and old furniture, but Harold said it could be mine if I wanted it. He said the bookstore needed a guardian, someone who would love it the way it deserved to be loved. So you became the guardian, I said. I became many things, Anthony replied with a gentle smile. Curator, event coordinator, unofficial town librarian. You see, Miss Whitman, your grandfather understood something that most business owners don't. A bookstore isn't just a place that sells books. It's a place where ideas live, where communities gather, where lonely people find connection. He stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the quiet street below. When Harold's health began to decline, he couldn't manage the day-to-day operations anymore, but he didn't want to close the store. He said it would be like letting the heart of the town stop beating. So we made an arrangement. I would keep the store running, quietly, behind the scenes. I would maintain the inventory, organize events, keep the literary spirit of Milbrook alive. The poetry readings, I said, remembering the newspaper articles I had found. The book clubs. That was you. That was us, Anthony corrected. Harold may have been in the nursing home, but his spirit was still very much a part of this place. I would visit him every week, tell him about the events, about the people who came, about the books that were finding their way to the right readers. Even when his memory began to fade, he would light up when I talked about the store. I felt a lump forming in my throat. He never told anyone about you. He was protecting me, Anthony said simply. I had no legal right to be here, no official status. If the authorities had known, if the insurance company had found out, it would have been a disaster for everyone. So we kept it quiet. Harold told people the store was closed, that he was too ill to run it anymore. But really, it was more alive than it had ever been. He returned to his chair, his eyes meeting mine with a directness that was both gentle and challenging. Which brings us to the present situation. You've inherited not just a building and a business, Miss Whitman. You've inherited a responsibility, a legacy. The question is, what do you plan to do with it? I stared into my teacup, my mind reeling. Everything I thought I knew about my inheritance had been turned upside down. The failing bookstore I had planned to sell was actually a thriving community center. The burden I had wanted to escape was actually a gift beyond measure. And the grandfather I had barely known had been quietly performing acts of extraordinary kindness right up until the end of his life. The development company, I said, finally, they want to tear down the whole block. Anthony nodded gravely. I know. They've been circling like vultures for months. They see an empty building, a dead business, a piece of property ripe for development. They have no idea what they would be destroying. But legally, you have no claim to this place, I said. If I sell, you'll have to leave. Yes, Anthony said simply. I understand that. I've always understood that this arrangement was temporary, dependent on the kindness of others. I've been preparing for this day for years. Preparing how? He smiled sadly. I've been documenting everything. The history of the store, the events we've hosted, the people whose lives have been touched by this place. I've been creating an archive,
a record of what this bookstore has meant to this community, so that even if the building is torn down, the memory will survive. I felt tears stinging my eyes. Here was a man who had lost everything, who had been given a second chance by my grandfather's kindness, and who was now facing the loss of his home and purpose with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout our conversation. "The development company," I said, finally. "They want to tear down the whole block." Anthony nodded gravely. "I know. They've been circling like vultures for months. They see an empty building, a dead business, a piece of property ripe for development. They have no idea what they would be destroying." "But legally, you have no claim to this place," I said. "If I sell, you'll have to leave." "Yes," Anthony said simply. "I understand that. I've always understood that this arrangement was temporary, dependent on the kindness of others. I've been preparing for this day for years." "Preparing how?" He smiled sadly. "I've been documenting everything. The history of the store, the events we've hosted, the people whose lives have been touched by this place. I've been creating an archive, a record of what this bookstore has meant to this community, so that even if the building is torn down, the memory will survive." I felt tears stinging my eyes. Here was a man who had lost everything, who had been given a second chance by my grandfather's kindness, and who was now facing the loss of his home and purpose with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout our conversation. "The development company," I said. "Its offer would solve all my financial problems. I could pay off my student loans, start fresh somewhere else." "Yes," Anthony said quietly. "You could. But if I sell, all of this disappears. The events, the community, your home, everything my grandfather built." "Yes," Anthony said again. I turned back to face him. "And if I don't sell, if I try to keep the store running?"
Anthony's eyes lit up with a hope he was trying hard to contain. "Then we continue the work. Together, if you're willing. I can teach you everything Harold taught me about running a bookstore, about building a literary community. It won't make you rich, but it will make you part of something larger than yourself." I thought about my cramped studio apartment, my dead-end job as a substitute teacher, my mountain of debt. I thought about the safe, practical choice of selling to the developers and walking away with enough money to start over. And then I thought about my grandfather, a man I had barely known, but who had apparently spent his life quietly making the world a better place, one book and one act of kindness at a time. "There's one condition," I said finally. Anthony raised an eyebrow. "Yes?" "You can't be a secret anymore. If we're going to do this, if we're going to run this place together, then you need to be a full partner. Legal, official, above board. No more hiding behind bookshelves." A slow smile spread across Anthony's face, the first truly joyful expression I had seen from him. "Miss Whitman, I think your grandfather would be very proud of you." The next few months were a whirlwind of paperwork, renovations, and revelations. I moved to Milbrook permanently, renting a small apartment above the hardware store that was slowly coming back to life as other young people began to discover the town's quiet charms. Anthony and I worked together to bring the bookstore fully into the light, registering it as a proper business, obtaining the necessary permits, and creating a legal partnership that protected both of us. The grand reopening of Pages in Time was held on a crisp Saturday morning in December. The entire town seemed to turn out for the event, along with people from neighboring communities who had heard about our story through word of mouth and local media coverage. Anthony, no longer hiding in the shadows, stood beside me as we cut the ribbon, his face glowing with pride and happiness. The store was transformed, but still recognizably itself. We had cleaned and organized the inventory, created comfortable reading areas, and installed a small cafe in one corner, where Anthony served his famous tea and coffee.
The second floor became our event space, where we hosted readings, book clubs, writing workshops, and lectures on local history. But the most important change was the sense of openness, of welcome, that now permeated the entire building. People no longer had to discover us by accident or through whispered recommendations. We were a visible, vital part of the community, a place where anyone could come to find a good book, a warm drink, and a friendly conversation. Anthony thrived in his new role as the public face of the store's literary programming. His years of hiding had not diminished his natural gifts as a teacher and storyteller. If anything, they had deepened his appreciation for human connection and his understanding of the power of books to heal and inspire. As for me, I discovered that I had inherited more than just a building and a business. I had inherited a calling. Working alongside Anthony, learning from his vast knowledge and gentle wisdom, I found a sense of purpose I had never experienced in my previous life. I was no longer just surviving from paycheck to paycheck. I was building something meaningful, something that would outlast both of us.
The financial success of the store continued to grow as word spread about what we were doing. We received grants from arts organizations, donations from book lovers around the country, and steady income from our expanding program of events and services. I was able to pay off my student loans within 2 years, not through a quick sale to developers, but through the slow, steady work of building a sustainable business based on community and connection. One evening, as Anthony and I were closing up the store after a particularly successful poetry reading, I found myself thinking about the choice I had made. The developers had eventually given up on our block and moved on to other projects. The hardware store had reopened under new management. The diner was being renovated by a young couple who had fallen in love with the town's potential. "Do you ever regret it?" Anthony asked, as if reading my thoughts. "Giving up the easy money for all this hard work?" I looked around the store, at the shelves full of books that were finding their way to the right readers, at the comfortable chairs where people gathered to share ideas and stories, at the bulletin board covered with thank you notes from community members whose lives had been touched by what we were doing. "Never," I said. "This is exactly where I'm supposed to be." Anthony smiled and nodded toward a framed photograph that hung behind the counter. It was a picture of my grandfather, taken in the store many years ago, surrounded by books and wearing the same gentle expression I had come to associate with this place. "He knew," Anthony said quietly. "Somehow, Harold knew that you would make the right choice. He used to say that books have a way of finding their way to the people who need them most. I think the same thing is true of bookstores." As I locked the door and turned off the lights, I realized that Anthony was right. I hadn't just inherited a bookstore. I had inherited a legacy of kindness, a tradition of putting community before profit, and a responsibility to keep the literary heart of a small town beating for future generations. The ghost I had thought was haunting pages and time turned out to be something far more precious, the living spirit of compassion and connection that my grandfather had fostered, that Anthony had preserved, and that I was now privileged to carry forward. It was a haunting I would never want to escape. What an incredible story about finding family and purpose in the most unexpected places. The bond between Ashley and Anthony shows us that sometimes the most important inheritances can't be measured in dollars. What do you think about Ashley's choice to keep the bookstore instead of taking the easy money? Let us know in the comments below. If you loved this heartwarming story of second chances and hidden treasures, please show your support by hitting that like button and be sure to subscribe for more amazing stories every day. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.